Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Brian's Horror Corner. Welcome to this horror movie review as part of my 31 Horror Movies in May series. Today, we're going to take a look at a sequel of a movie that I reviewed exactly a year ago, actually, as part of the same series in 2021. Um, and that movie was 28 Days Later. Today, we're going to go ahead and review the sequel, 28 Weeks Later. So yeah, I have this two pack here. I have 28 Days Later on Blu-ray. Um, but I also to get 28 Weeks Later, I got this double pack here. It was pretty cheap. So I have two copies technically of 28 Days Later, but I watched my Blu-ray version of that. This is the only version I have of 28 Weeks Later. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get into 28 Weeks Later today. Um, I actually kind of, well, I didn't forget about it. I didn't actually pick this up until late last year, after I did my 31 horror movie series last year. So that's why it took me a year to review the sequel. But anyway, 28 Weeks Later is a 2007 post-apocalyptic horror film directed by Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, who co-wrote it with Rowan Joffe, Enrique Lopez Levine, and Jesus Olmo. Wow, it must be nice to have that name. It's the prequel to the 2002 film 28 Days Later. It is set after the events of the first film, depicting the efforts of NATO military forces to salvage a safe zone in London, the consequences of two young siblings breaking protocol to find their infected mother, and the resulting reintroduction of the rage virus to the safe zone. So that's kind of the gist of this movie. So basically, during the original outbreak of the rage virus, Don, his wife Alice, and four more survivors hide in a barricaded cottage in the outskirts of London. They hear a terrified boy pounding on their door, and Alice lets him in. A few minutes later, they discover that the infected have followed the boy. The infected attack and kill most of the survivors, while Don, Alice, and the boy are chased upstairs. Don pleads with Alice to leave the boy, but she refuses. He abandons them as the infected break into their room by escaping out of the window. After watching his wife being dragged out of sight by the infected, he narrowly escapes on a boat piloted by Jacob, one of the remaining survivors, who falls in the water and is overcome by the infected. After the infected begin to die out of starvation, NATO forces take control of Britain. So this would be the 28 months later part here. 28 weeks. Oh yeah, 28 weeks after the outbreak, an American force under the command of um, Brigadier General Stone brings in settlers. Among the new arrivals are Don and Alice's children, Tammy and Andy, who were out of the country during the outbreak. They are admitted to District 1, a safe zone on the Isle of Dogs, guarded by U.S. Army Sergeant Doyle, a Delta Force sniper, and his friend. Chief Flynn, a helicopter pilot, are amongst the troops guarding this district. Tammy and Andy are reunited with their father, who was found by the U.S. Army and has become the district's caretaker. In their new flat, Don fabricates a lie about the circumstances surrounding their mother's death. So yeah, that's basically the setup and the premise of this movie. Cast-wise, we have Robert Carlyle as Don, Rose Byrne as Scarlet, Jeremy Renner as Doyle, Harold Perrineau as Flynn, Catherine McCormick as Alice, Macintosh Muggleton as Andy, Imogen Poots as Tammy, and Idris Elba as Stone. So yeah, pretty good cast there. So yeah, that's the setup, premise, and cast for the sequel to this movie, 28 Weeks Later, which came out 5 years later. So let's just get into my thoughts and reviews. So I hadn't obviously seen 28 Weeks Later before, um, but I really like 28 Days Later. In fact, if you want to check that out, I still have my review up on my channel. You just have to go back about a year to May of last year and part of my 31 horror movie series. It's actually, I think, the first video I did for that series. So day one, May 1st. As far as the pros goes, I thought this movie had a pretty good, well-developed story that ultimately leads to the rage virus taking shape again, but also gives us some compelling characters to follow and care about. I mean, you have this family, the father and mother and two kids. The two kids were away during the initial outbreak, and the father and the mother got separated, and the mother wouldn't leave a small child, and the father basically ran out on her. I mean, escaped with his own life and didn't go back for her. So right away, that kind of leads to some guilt by him, and some question by the children, and things like that. So I just thought the story was very interesting. It'd be very easy to just throw some crap together to have the rage virus come back, but I thought the way it was done was pretty good. I think it's a well directed movie by Fresnadillo, who I haven't seen direct anything else. I haven't seen any of his other movies, but considering he had to follow up Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later, which is definitely a classic in many people's eyes, a horror classic, I felt like he did a good job not copying it specifically, but having his own version, his own vision and take on the rage virus idea. Um, Still had some of the same societal and social themes as the original that made for an effective and relatable watch, in my opinion. One thing about these movies, it's not just about well, I don't consider them to be zombie movies. I know technically you could, but these are rage virus infected people. I mean, because they're not really undead. That's why they're not really zombies. They're people that have been injected with this virus, this rage virus. Um, but I mean, if you want to call it a zombie movie, that's fine. Most do, but they're not just zombie movies or rage infected movies. These movies speak a lot about the breakdown of society when all hell breaks loose, basically. And these movies are scary in two ways. One is obviously the rage monsters, if you will. That's more of the visual, visceral scares of the movie. But then the underlying deeper themes of the movie are even have their own level of horror, which is what happens when governments basically, as you saw in the first movie and definitely in this one, where shoot on scene, basically take out once they lose control. Um, of an area, they basically just shoot anybody that you see move, basically, and they don't separate infected versus regular people. And it really touches on this movie as well as the first one really touches on those strong themes. So I was glad to see that movie still included those type of things and didn't just have it as a zombie movie. I thought there were good performances by the main cast, very believable and invested in their roles within the movie, especially Jeremy Renner and Rose Byrne. Idris Elba too, even though he really wasn't in the movie that much. He had a pretty small part for an actor of his caliber. But I thought those three, which are the most well-known three, did a good job. But really, the overall cast, I thought, did a really good job in the movie for the kind of movie that it is. I really enjoyed the opening scene, the first 10 or 15 minutes of the movie. It does a really good job of getting the audience or the viewer of this movie sort of into it and kind of remember from 5 years ago what this whole thing was like. Yeah, it really gets you into the movie and gets you engaged in it right away. So I also like the ending of the movie, sort of ambiguous, but clearly it opens the door for a sequel, which we'll get into that at the end of my video. But yeah, it's just a very interesting and creepy ending. I thought there was good makeup and gore effects on the Rage virus zombies, a little bit more bloody and gory movie too than the first one in 28 Days Later, which really wasn't bloody or gory at all. It really didn't need to be though to be effective. But yeah, good makeup and effects. I thought it added to the fun of the watch, the goriness of it, especially the helicopter scene, which I have to bring up. One of my favorite scenes in the movie where basically the who is it Flynn, the helicopter pilot, comes in to pick up some of the survivors, including like Rose Byrne and Jeremy Renner's characters and the kids of this family as well, and then just decides to basically just zooms down into these infected people and just it's just nothing but a bloody gory fest as of course the propellers just chop these zombies up. That was a really fun scene. Really well shot and good looking movie regarding the cinematography as well. I love some of the imagery of this movie, both at the beginning, when the infested are sort of running down a hill towards one of our characters, and then, of course, at the end when they're running out and we get a shot of the Eiffel Tower, and all of these rage infested people are running towards the Eiffel Tower. Boy, I can't talk today. It's very visually appealing. And this movie also has a lot of good action in it. So those are my pros for the movie. As you can see, I like this movie quite a bit, especially as a follow-up sequel. A couple of cons that I do have. some of the characters typically make the questionable decisions per usual that you get in a lot of horror movies that, of course, are done to move the plot forward. And definitely in the case of this movie, that's the case where, spoiler alert, well, no, I'm not going to give you too many spoilers, but a couple of the younger people, let's say in the cast, do things that just aren't very smart. And that kind of opens Pandora's box, if you will. Although one of our characters at the very beginning, you could argue, sort of sets all this in motion. So I also didn't feel like the overall tone or atmosphere. Boy, I got to take my words slowly today. I guess I'm trying to get ahead of myself. I didn't feel like the overall tone or atmosphere of the movie was quite as isolating or creepy as it was in 28 Days Later. This definitely feels more like a Hollywood big budgeted studio movie compared to the first one, which was more independent with a smaller movie. Um, Overall, I just didn't think this movie was quite as scary to me. It's still good, but just not as effectively scary as the first one was. But it still had some good scares to it. Um, there was some CGI that was used that was pretty noticeable that I could have done without in this movie as well, but there wasn't too much. Um, Overall, this just so I'm going to make a comparison now between these two movies to another two movies that came out probably like 30 or 40 years before these two. Well, no, that's 30 or 40 years from now. It would when these came out, it would be like 20 or 30 years before these two movies. And that's Alien and Aliens. These two kind of remind me, I don't want to say they're a carbon copy. Obviously, they're different movies, but they remind me of the differences in the two. Like the first Alien was very isolating, very creepy with a small crew and only one alien, but it was scarier. It was more of a horror movie. Where the second one, they had a much bigger budget. They opened up the movie, had a lot more aliens, a lot more shooting, a lot more action, a lot more characters and aliens. Both movies are great. They're just different. And that's kind of how I feel about these two. Like this is more of a horror. I mean, they're both horror movies, but I think this one works a little bit better as a horror movie. This one's more of this is much more of an action-packed movie. So you're never really bored watching this movie. Not that you are in this one. It's just that in this one, there's more isolating scenes. More you're waiting for something to jump out at you. Where in this one, it's kind of wall to wall shooting, not as many scares, just a lot more action. So it's really just a personal preference, and kind of what you're in the mood for in terms of which one you want to watch. Um, but I really enjoyed 28 Weeks Later. I thought it's a very good sequel and follow up. I still prefer this one, especially as a horror movie. I'm not one of those that thinks 28 Weeks Later is actually better than the first one, but I also don't think it's that far off the first one. Like I said, I compare Alien to Aliens is the ultimate comparison, in my opinion, to these two. And now getting on to what I put off 28 months later, which was talked about as soon as this movie wrapped up 14 years ago, actually 15 years ago now. Wow, time flies. I know Danny Boyle was going to come back and direct it, but there's all kinds of, I think there's copyright things and there's a bunch of other tape and a bunch of other bureaucracy involved with it, like there isn't a lot of movie series and franchises and all that kind of stuff. So whether or not it's still going to happen yet, I don't know. If there's going to be a third movie at 28 months later, but I know it's been talked about over the last decade and a half. But right now, these are the only two that we have. So yeah, that's really all I got, guys. Like I said, I really enjoyed these movies. Talking specifically about 28 Weeks Later, I'm going to go ahead and give it an 8 out of 10. I think for what it is, I think it's effective. Like I said, less horror, more action, but still enough horror for me to obviously keep it in my horror collection. Um, yeah, Aliens. 28 Days Later, 28 Weeks Later. I'm not going to stop harping on that because that's really what I thought as soon as this movie was over. But I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I don't think it's as good as the follow up to Alien. I mean, Aliens is just one of my favorite action movies of all time. I'm not sure this one is, although maybe if I watch it one or two more times, I'll feel differently. But um, so it's not quite on that level, but the comparison I think is valid. So 8 out of 10 for 28 Weeks Later. Go ahead and comment down below, guys, what you thought of the follow up to 28 Days Later, known as 28 Weeks Later from 2007. Did you like it? Didn't you like it? Why not? Please like this video and hit the little notification bell down below so you don't miss any of my upcoming videos in this series. And please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my great horror content coming up over the next several months. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day and stay scared. Bye.